She's got her fingers wedged into a gap that shouldn't exist. A seam in the floorboards behind the altar, where the wood has buckled and gone soft with 50 years of rain, finding its way through a hole in the roof. The crowbar keeps slipping. Her knuckles are already split open, and she doesn't notice because there's something under there. Something metal. She heard it when her flashlight rolled across the boards an hour ago. A hollow sound, where hollow sound has no business being. Mara Whitfield is 23 years old, and 3 weeks ago she had $11 to her name. She gets the crowbar seated right this time, leans her whole body into it. The board gives with a crack that echoes up into the bell tower, into the broken stained glass, into 40 years of silence. And for 1 second, before the dust settles, she sees the corner of something dark and rectangular wedged into the crawl space below. Metal. Old. Locked. She doesn't know yet what's inside it. She doesn't know it's about to answer a question she's been asking her whole life without knowing she was asking it. But we need to back up, because 3 weeks ago, Mara didn't own a church. She didn't own anything. 3 weeks earlier, she was standing in a parking lot behind a bakery that used to have her name on the lease, watching a man she used to call family drive away in a truck she'd made the down payment on. Her business partner, her cousin Denny, the only blood relative who'd ever bothered to stay in touch after her parents died, had spent 8 months quietly moving the bakery's accounts into his name while Mara worked doubles. By the time she understood what had happened, the locks were already changed. $11, a duffel bag of clothes, and a busted phone were what she walked away with. She'd grown up in 3 different foster placements between the ages of 9 and 18, learned early that asking for help rarely got her anywhere, and learned just as early how to fix a leaking faucet, patch a tire, and disappear into a room so nobody's temper landed on her. She was good at surviving. She had never once been good at trusting people, and Denny had just spent 8 months proving to her that the instinct wasn't broken after all. She was sleeping in her car outside a Pilot gas station off Route 9 when the letter caught up to her, forwarded twice, from an old address to an older one, finally to a friend's apartment where she'd left a mailing address months back, out of habit more than hope. It was from a county clerk's office in a place called Amity Hollow, a town she'd never heard of, population somewhere under 900. It said that a property, a church, decommissioned, structurally condemned, sitting on 4 acres, had gone up for public auction after 17 years of unpaid back taxes, and that as the sole surviving heir of one Elias Whitfield, she had inherited first right of claim. Elias Whitfield. She'd met him exactly once, at her mother's funeral, when she was 11. He was her great-uncle, her grandfather's younger brother, a tall, quiet man who'd shaken her hand like she was already grown and told her, "You come from stubborn people. That's not the worst thing to come from." She hadn't thought about him in over a decade. The back taxes and transfer fees came to $1.40. She almost laughed out loud in the parking lot. $1.40 for a building. Everyone she called that week, the 2 people left who'd still pick up, told her the same thing. It's not worth the gas to drive out there. It's condemned, Mara. Sell the land, if anyone even wants it. Don't go falling in love with a pile of rot because a dead man you didn't know left it to you. She went anyway. She didn't have anywhere else to be. Have you ever had a moment where the smart thing and the only thing were the exact same decision? That was Amity Hollow for her. Not brave, just out of other doors to knock on. The drive took 4 hours on roads that got narrower and rougher the further she went, past a feed store, a diner with a hand-painted sign, a gas station with 1 working pump. The town thinned out into farmland, then into trees, and then the road just stopped being paved at all. She found the church at the end of a gravel track half swallowed by weeds, and for a long moment she just sat in the car with the engine off, looking at it. It had probably been white once. Now the paint had gone the grey of old bone, peeling in long strips off clapboard siding that sagged in the middle like it was tired of standing. The steeple leaned 4, maybe 5 degrees off true. Half the windows were boarded, and the ones that weren't showed jagged teeth of coloured glass, red and amber, catching the late afternoon light in a way that was almost beautiful if you didn't look too closely at the water damage staining the wall beneath them black. The front steps had rotted through on one side. A shutter hung by a single hinge and knocked softly against the wall every time the wind moved through. A slow, patient sound, like something waiting. She sat there a long time before she made herself get out of the car. Up close it was worse, and it was better, both at once. Worse, because the smell hit her first. Wet wood, mildew, something faintly sweet underneath that she didn't want to think too hard about. Better, because the bones of the place were good. Whoever built this hadn't cut corners. The timber frame under all that rot was hand-hewn oak, joined the old way, no nails, and even half collapsed it was holding together through sheer stubborn craftsmanship. She stood in the doorway with her one duffel bag and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not hope, exactly. Recognition, like meeting something that had also been left to fend for itself and had decided, out of pure spite, to still be standing. She thought about turning around. She had $11 and a car with a quarter tank and a town 4 hours behind her where nobody was expecting her back. She thought about it for maybe 30 seconds, standing on a step that might not hold her weight, in a doorway that smelled like rot and old rain. Then she stepped inside, because outside had nothing for her either. The nave was a wreck of collapsed pews and pigeon droppings, and a shaft of coloured light falling through a broken window onto the floor where the altar still stood, listing slightly, one leg shorter than the others. But it was dry in patches, and there was a wood stove in the back corner that looked like it might still draw, and there was, she'd learn later, a working well out past the tree line that some long-gone congregation had dug by hand. She spent that first night wrapped in her car blanket on the driest section of floor she could find, listening to the shutter knock against the wall, and she told herself this was temporary, a place to sleep for a week while she figured out her next move. She did not yet know about the locked cabinet built into the wall behind the pulpit, its brass fittings gone green, that a local would mention offhand 3 days later with a strange look on his face. She did not know that a woman at the feed store would go quiet when she heard the name Whitfield, then change the subject. She did not know that Elias Whitfield had spent the last 19 years of his life alone in this building, doing something with his hands and his hours that nobody in Amity Hollow had ever fully understood. All she knew that first night was that the floorboards behind the altar sounded wrong when she walked across them. Hollow, where hollow had no business being. She'd remember that sound. It would take her 3 weeks to go looking for what was making it. Morning came in sideways through the broken window, a thin grey light that made the whole nave look like something underwater. Mara woke stiff and cold, her neck aching from the car blanket, doing a poor job as a pillow, and lay there a moment just listening. No traffic, no neighbours, just wind moving through gaps in the siding, and, somewhere overhead, the soft scrabble of birds nesting in the eaves. She'd survived worse mornings. She got up. The well was the first order of business, and it took her an hour of hauling on a rope gone stiff with age before the bucket came up full and clean-smelling, which felt like more good luck than she'd had in a month combined. She drank straight from the bucket, splashed her face, and stood there afterward with water dripping off her chin, looking at the church in daylight for the first time. It was worse than she'd thought, and also, she was starting to suspect, not as far gone as everyone had told her. The roof had a hole over the vestibule, but the main roofline was intact. The siding was ugly, but the frame beneath it, wherever she could see it, was solid old oak, dry and sound. Someone, at some point, had replaced sections of it with real skill, recent skill. Sections of siding that couldn't have been more than 10 or 15 years old, patched in among wood that had clearly stood since the building went up. That didn't square with a place that had sat, condemned and abandoned, for 17 years of unpaid taxes. She filed it away and kept working. By midday, hunger got the better of pride, and she walked the 1.5 miles into town on legs that were sore from 4 hours of driving and a night on a hard floor. Amity Hollow's main street was 4 blocks of low brick buildings, a diner, a hardware store with a faded awning, a feed and grain that doubled as the closest thing to a general store. She had $11. She spent 2 of them on a coffee at the diner and sat in a booth trying to look like she belonged somewhere, anywhere, and that was where she met Ruth. Ruth Calloway ran the diner and had run it, by her own account, since Nixon was in office, though she said it like a joke she'd told 1,000 times and still half meant. She was somewhere north of 60, built solid, with forearms like a woman who'd spent her life lifting things heavier than a coffee pot, and she had a way of looking at a person that felt like being weighed on a scale you couldn't see. She set a plate of eggs down in front of Mara that Mara hadn't ordered. "On the house," Ruth said, before Mara could object. "You're the one that took the church." News traveled fast in a town of 900. Mara admitted she was Elias's girl. Ruth said it like she was testing the shape of the words. Didn't know he had people left. Didn't either, until 3 weeks ago. Mara kept her voice light, the way she'd learned to keep her voice light about anything that mattered. "I met him once, at a funeral. I was 11. Something crossed Ruth's face then. Not quite sympathy. Something more complicated. Gone before Mara could read it. He kept to himself the last years. Came in maybe once a month for supplies. Nice enough man. Sad, though. You could see it on him. Sad the way some men carry it. Quiet, like it's not asking for anybody's help." She refilled Mara's coffee without asking. He was always working on that church. Every year a little more of it fixed than the year before. Folks used to wonder what he thought he was building it back up for. No congregation left. Hadn't held a service out there in, Lord, 30 years, maybe more. That was the second piece that didn't fit. A man alone, with no congregation, spending 19 years quietly rebuilding a church that would never hold a service again. "You wonder what for?" Mara said, mostly to herself. Ruth's eyes flicked toward the kitchen doorway and back, quick, like she'd almost said something and thought better of it. "Man's allowed his reasons," she said instead, and changed the subject to whether Mara had someone to help her clear that roof before the next rain, because a young woman alone out there, with a hole letting weather in, was a problem that wasn't going to fix itself. That someone turned out to be Ruth's nephew, a lean, quiet man in his 30s named Cole Bennett, who fixed roofs and did carpentry, and, according to Ruth, didn't have the sense God gave a fence post when it came to charging people what he was worth. Cole showed up at the church 2 days later in a truck that had seen better decades, took one long look at the roofline, and told Mara, not unkindly, just flatly, that she had maybe 3 weeks before the next real rain came through and did damage that couldn't be undone cheap. "I've got $11, Mara told him. No sense pretending otherwise. 9 now. Cole considered that for a second, chewing on it, the way he seemed to chew on most things before speaking. "I'll trade you labor for information," he said finally. "I want to know what a man spends 19 years alone fixing up a church nobody prays in for. You find that out, you tell me we're square." She didn't know yet that she'd end up wanting the answer to that question more than he did. He worked 3 days on the roof, refusing every time she tried to talk about payment, and Mara worked alongside him, hauling shingles and holding ladders steady and learning, without really meaning to, the difference between a rafter that was sound and one that only looked it. She was a fast study. She'd always been a fast study. It was one of the only things foster care had ever given her for free, the ability to watch someone do a task once and have her hands understand it by the second try. It was on the second day, up on the roof, that Cole mentioned the cabinet. "There's a built-in behind the pulpit," he said, hammering a shingle into place without looking up. Locked. Elias had the only key, near as anybody knew. Man from the county came through after he passed, tried to get it open for inventory purposes, gave up when he couldn't find a way in. That didn't mean tearing out good wood to do it. A pause, a nail set. Nobody ever did find that key. Mara's hands went still on the ladder. "What's in it?" Cole shrugged, and there was something careful in the shrug, something that made her think he'd wondered about it plenty himself, and decided it wasn't his business to wonder out loud. Man kept to himself. Wasn't for anybody in this town to go prying. He said it like a rule he was reminding himself of as much as her. That night, after Cole's truck had rattled off down the gravel track, Mara stood in the dim nave with her one working flashlight and looked at the cabinet built into the wall behind the listing altar. Dark wood, brass fittings gone the green-black of old age, a keyhole that had clearly been picked at, unsuccessfully, more than once. She pressed her palm flat against the door and felt, absurdly, like she was touching something that was waiting on purpose. Patient, the way the shutter outside knocked patient against the wall. She didn't have a key. She didn't, yet, have any right to what was behind that door beyond the fact that her name was on a deed nobody else had wanted. But underneath her feet, when she walked back across the floor behind the altar, there was still that sound, hollow, where hollow had no business being. And now she had two mysteries in one small ruined room, and a great-uncle she'd met exactly once, who had apparently spent 19 years of solitary devotion on a building that, by every account she'd heard so far, had absolutely nothing left in this world to justify it. She fell asleep that night making a list in her head of everything that didn't add up. And somewhere in the dark, past the edge of sleep, she thought she heard the shutter stop knocking, just for a moment, like the wind itself had paused to listen along with her. The rain Cole warned her about held off for 4 more days, which was long enough for Mara to fall into something like a rhythm. Mornings for water and firewood, middays for whatever repair Cole could teach her before he had to get back to paying jobs. Afternoons alone in the nave, with a broom and a crowbar, and a growing list of small, nagging details that refused to sit still in her mind. She'd started keeping the list on the back of an old church bulletin she'd found wedged in a pew. The date on it faded, but the year still legible, 19 years back, near as she could figure, right around when Cole said Elias had started his solitary rebuilding project. She wrote in pencil stub she'd found in the vestibule. Cabinet, no key. Floor sound, behind altar. New wood, old building. Why? Ruth knows something. Cole's careful about a question he doesn't ask. It was the 4th item that nagged at her most, in a low-grade way, the way a splinter nags before you find it. Cole was careful. Careful the way people are careful around a grief that isn't theirs to carry, but that they've been asked, somehow, to help hold anyway. She asked him about it, directly on the 4th day, up in the bell tower, where he was checking the frame for rot, before he'd let her set foot up there herself. Your aunt got a strange look on her face when she said his name. So did you, when I asked what he was building all this for. What is it people around here aren't saying to me? Cole didn't answer right away. He tested a beam with the flat of his hand, satisfied himself it would hold his weight, and sat down on it before he spoke. "It's not my story to tell you," he said. "That's the honest truth of it, not me dodging you. Elias never told anybody the whole thing. Bits and pieces, over years, to different people, and I don't think even Aunt Ruth's got all of it stitched together." He looked out through the tower's open slats at the tree line, gone gold-green in the late afternoon. "What I can tell you is he wasn't always a man who kept to himself. Ruth says he used to be different. Before. Before what? Don't know. That's the honest truth too. He said it steady, not unkindly, and something in the way he said it made her believe him. I know he had a wife once. Long before my time. Before Ruth's even. Near enough. I know there's nobody left in this county who remembers her name. And I know he came back here alone, sometime after, and never left again, and started fixing this church up board by board like it was the only job left in the world worth doing right. A wife. Nobody had mentioned a wife. She wrote it on the bulletin that night, under the other 4 items, and underlined it twice. A wife. Where did she go? The rain came on the 5th day, and it came hard. A real autumn storm that turned the gravel track to soup, and found every weak seam in the roof Cole hadn't gotten to yet. Mara spent half the night with a stockpot catching drips in the vestibule, and the other half lying awake, listening to the building groan under the weight of the water, feeling for the first time a genuine flicker of fear that the whole structure might not hold. It held. Barely, but it held. And she woke in the grey morning to a church that smelled even more powerfully of wet wood and a fresh scatter of debris in the nave, knocked loose by the wind, including a section of rotted plaster that had come away from the wall near the cabinet, exposing bare lath behind it. And behind the lath, tucked into a gap between 2 studs, was a photograph. It had curled with age and damp, the edges gone soft and brown, but the image was still clear enough. A young man, dark-haired, standing in front of the church. The same church, unmistakably, with a fresh coat of white paint and a congregation's worth of people arranged on the front steps behind him, dressed in the style of some 40, 50 years back. Beside him stood a young woman in a pale dress, her hand tucked into his arm, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. Mara turned it over. On the back, in fountain pen gone brown with age, someone had written a single line, E. And M, the day we opened the doors. E for Elias, she was almost certain. And M, she sat with that photograph a long time, rain still coming down outside in a steady grey hush, turning the questions over. A wife whose name nobody remembered. A photograph hidden inside a wall, not lost, not forgotten, hidden, the way a person hides something they can't bear to look at every day, but can't bear to throw away either. A locked cabinet with no key, a floor that sounded hollow where hollow had no business being. She thought about Ruth's careful face and Cole's careful silence, and she understood, sitting there, that this whole town was quietly keeping a story for a man who could no longer tell it himself, and that she had been left the one place in the world where all the pieces of that story were still buried, waiting on someone stubborn enough to go looking. She wrapped the photograph in a dry cloth and set it on the windowsill where the light would find it in the morning, and for the first time since she'd arrived in Amity Hollow, the questions crowding her mind didn't feel like a burden. They felt like an invitation. Outside, the rain was already beginning to thin, and somewhere past the tree line, faint and strange, she thought she heard the sound of the old church bell. The one Cole had told her hadn't rung in decades, its rope long since rotted away. Give one single low note into the wet morning air, like something disturbed by all that water finally settling back into place. She told herself it was the wind. She wasn't sure she believed it. And she still had a locked cabinet, a hollow floor, and a name, M, that she was determined, one way or another, to put a face and a story to, before she let herself rest. The photograph sat on the windowsill for 3 days, before Mara worked up the nerve to show it to Ruth, mostly because some stubborn, private part of her wanted to earn a few more answers on her own first. She spent those 3 days doing something she hadn't planned on doing. She started actually fixing the place, not just patching what had failed, but working through it room by room, the way she imagined a person did who meant to stay. She learned to glaze the broken windows from a video on Cole's phone, since her own had finally died for good, standing in his truck cab in the church lot, with the engine running for the charge. She learned to reset a hinge, to true up a door that had dropped in its frame, to mix mortar for the front steps that had rotted through. Her hands, already good at learning fast, got faster. By the end of the third day, the church didn't look repaired so much as it looked like a building somebody had decided to fight for, patch by patch, and there was something in that Mara recognized from the inside of her own chest. She brought the photograph to the diner on a slow Tuesday afternoon, and Ruth went quiet in a way Mara hadn't seen from her yet. Not careful quiet, but stricken quiet, the coffee pot hovering forgotten over an empty cup. "Marion," Ruth said finally, so soft Mara almost missed it. Her name was Marion. It was the first time anyone had said the name out loud in Mara's hearing, and it landed like a small key turning somewhere. What happened to her? Ruth set the coffee pot down like it had gotten heavy. She died young. Cancer. This was, Lord, must be near 40 years back now. They'd only been married 6, 7 years. No children. A pause. Her eyes distant, somewhere back in a version of the town Mara had never seen. Elias wasn't from here originally. Came here as a young preacher, fresh out of seminary. Brought Marion with him as a bride, and the two of them built this congregation up from nothing near enough. Everybody loved her. She had a way of making a stranger feel like family inside of 5 minutes. Ruth looked at the photograph again, at the two young people laughing on the church steps. When she passed, something in him just went out. He preached another year, maybe 2, going through the motions, and then one Sunday he just didn't show up to open the doors, and he never did again. Congregation drifted off to churches in the next towns over. Building sat empty, going on 10 years before he came back to it. Came back? Where'd he go? Nobody rightly knows. He was gone the better part of a decade, showed back up one spring, older, quieter, and just started fixing the place, board by board, like Marion might walk back through those doors any day, and he wanted it ready for her. Ruth's voice caught slightly. Man never remarried, never really came back to himself, not all the way. But he worked on that church every day the Lord sent him, right up until he passed, near 2 years ago now. Every day, for 19 years, on a building with no congregation left to fill it. Mara sat with that a long moment, feeling the shape of a whole life settling into place around one locked cabinet and one hollow floorboard. Ruth, do you know if there's a reason he'd have hidden something? Money, maybe. Or papers, something shifted behind Ruth's eyes. Not surprise, exactly. More like a door Ruth herself had wondered about opening and never quite dared to. There was talk, way back, she admitted slowly. Elias's people had land money, generations back, before he ever took up preaching. Family sold off timber rights on a big parcel up in the next county, made good money doing it, before Elias was even born. He never touched a dime of it in all the years he lived here, far as anyone could tell. Dressed plain, ate plain, drove a truck older than Cole's. Folks used to wonder where all that inheritance went, if it existed at all, or if it was just old town talk, grown taller with the years. She looked hard at Mara now. You're thinking he put it somewhere in that building. I'm thinking he built a whole church back up out of nothing but grief and something to do with his hands, Mara said slowly, working it out loud as she said it. And I don't think a man does that for a building. I think he does that for a person, for what a building meant to a person he loved. Ruth's eyes went bright, and she didn't try to hide it. That sounds like something he would have said. That evening, back at the church, with the sky gone violet-grey at the edges, Mara stood behind the altar with her crowbar and considered the hollow-sounding floor with new eyes. It wasn't a secret hidden out of shame or fear. If she was right, if she was even close to right, It was a widower's 19-year act of devotion, a monument built quietly, without an audience, to a woman named Marion who'd made strangers feel like family inside of 5 minutes. She knelt down and pressed her palm flat against the boards, feeling for the seam, and for the first time didn't feel like she was trespassing on a dead man's secret. She felt like she was about to be trusted with one. She didn't get the floor open that night. The seam was tighter than she expected, and full dark came on before she'd made real progress. And something about the hour and the quiet made her decide the work deserved daylight rather than a flashlight and impatience. But she lay awake a long while after, turning Marion's name over like a stone in her pocket, and wondering what a preacher who'd walked away from his own church for a decade of unexplained absence might have gone and done in all that missing time. Because a man didn't come back from 10 years gone, with nothing to show for it but grief and a plan. Somewhere in the dark, faint enough that she almost decided she'd dreamed it, the shutter outside gave its slow knock against the wall, once, twice, and then, oddly, went still, as if the wind itself were holding its breath along with her. Daylight made the hollow floor look almost ordinary, a stretch of pine boards no different from the rest, except for the faint dark line where water damage had softened the seams over decades. Mara knelt there most of the morning before Cole's truck rattled up the gravel track, unasked, the way he'd started doing more often than his aunt's coffee bribes really accounted for. "Figured you'd want a second set of hands for whatever you're about to do to my aunt's dead friend's church floor," he said, by way of hello, and set down a real crowbar next to Mara's borrowed one. She told him what Ruth had told her. Marion, the decade Elias vanished, the old talk of land money nobody ever saw spent. Cole listened with his arms crossed and didn't interrupt once, which she was coming to understand was the closest thing he had to being moved. "Well," he said when she'd finished, "only one way to find out if Old Town Talk's got any truth in it." It took the better part of an hour, working the crowbar into the seam by inches, easing nails that had rusted into the wood, almost past distinguishing from it. The board that finally gave did it all at once, with a crack that sent dust sifting down through the light from the broken window, and underneath, set into a shallow crawl space, lined with what looked like an old feed sack, gone stiff with age, was a metal strongbox, dark with tarnish, its hasp closed but not locked. Mara's hands, when she reached for it, weren't quite steady. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept the damp mostly out, was more money than she'd seen in one place in her whole life. Bundled bills. Not a fortune by a rich man's measure, but enough, she understood immediately, to mean the difference between surviving and actually building something. Beneath the bills, in a second oilcloth wrapping, were papers. A deed to a parcel of timberland 2 counties over, that Ruth had mentioned, still apparently in Elias's name, and, by the paper's account, never sold at all. The old family land, sitting untouched for 50 years. And beneath that, folded in thirds and gone soft as cloth from handling, a letter. Cole, to his credit, stood up without being asked, and said he'd go check the truck for something he definitely didn't need, and left her alone with it. The handwriting was the same fountain pen hand from the back of the photograph, shakier now. An older man's hand, but careful, the hand of someone who'd thought hard about every word before it went down. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and somehow this floor finally gave up what I asked it to keep. I don't know who you'll be, maybe no one. Maybe the county tears this place down before anybody thinks to look. But I have hoped, more nights than I can count, that it would be someone who needed it. Because money sitting in a hole under a floor does nobody any good, and I have had 19 years to think about what a thing is actually worth. I want to tell you plainly, the money is not the gift." I know how that sounds, coming from a dead man who hid money under a floor instead of spending it. But I mean it. The money will run out, the way money does. What I am hoping to leave you is the church itself. This stubborn, leaking, impossible building that Marion and I built up out of nothing when we were younger than you probably are now. She used to say a church wasn't the steeple or the pews, it was just people deciding to keep showing up for each other. I lost the showing up, for a long while, after I lost her. I came back to this building because it was the only place I still knew how to love her in. Whatever I fixed here, I fixed because it was the last conversation I had left to have with her. If you're reading this, I am asking you for something harder than forgiveness for the secrecy. I am asking you to let this place be more than a hiding spot for a dead man's money. Let it be a foundation. Build something on it that outlasts both of us. That is the whole of what I am leaving you. Not the cash, which will spend itself down to nothing inside a few years if that's all you use it for. But the chance. What you do with the chance is the only inheritance that ever really mattered, in my experience. There is one more thing I never managed to make peace with, and I won't pretend otherwise to you now. There is a second door in this building I could never bring myself to open again after Marion passed, because of what's behind it, and because of a promise I made her that I broke once already and couldn't bear to break twice. I have left the key somewhere I trust the right person to find, if they care enough to keep looking. I am sorry to leave you one more locked thing. I have come to believe some doors are only ever meant to be opened by someone who's earned the right to what's on the other side of them, and I never quite believed that person was me. E.W. Mara sat on the floor a long time after she finished reading, the letter loose in her hands, the strong box open beside her, the dust from the broken board still hanging faint in the shaft of colored light from the window. Outside, she could hear Cole pretending to do something useful to his truck's engine, giving her the privacy of grief that wasn't even her own to grieve, and she found herself crying anyway. For a man she'd met once at 11 years old, for a woman named Marion she'd never know beyond a photograph, and a name spoken soft in a diner, for the particular loneliness of loving someone so hard you couldn't bear to finish the conversation you started with them. The money is not the gift. She kept coming back to that line. She had $11 3 weeks ago, and she was holding, right now, more cash than she'd earned in the last 2 years combined. And the letter was telling her, plainly, that none of it was the point. She believed him. That was the strange part. Sitting there in the dust and the colored light, she believed him completely. But there was a second door. A cabinet behind the pulpit, locked, its key hidden somewhere Elias trusted the right person to find, and something behind it that a grieving man had never once, in 19 years of solitary devotion, brought himself to face. She folded the letter back along its old creases, careful as handling something alive, and looked across the nave at the cabinet's tarnished brass fittings, catching the last of the afternoon light. Whatever was behind that door, she understood now, was the last piece of Elias and Marion's story, and she was the only person left in the world who might ever find out what it was. Word travels fast in a town of 900, and money travels faster. Mara hadn't told a soul what was under that floor besides Cole, and Cole she trusted the way she was learning, slowly, to trust anyone, which was to say completely, once earned, and not 1 inch before. But somebody at the bank in the county seat where she'd gone to have the bills assessed for authenticity had apparently mentioned it to somebody else, and by the following week, the whole of Amity Hollow seemed to know that the Whitfield girl had found money in the old church. Not everyone took it well. Convenient, said a man named Hollis Pratt, loud enough to carry across the diner, the first time Mara came in for coffee after the news got out. He ran the hardware store 2 doors down and had, according to Ruth, wanted to buy the church land himself back when the county first put it up for auction. Wanted the acreage for a storage lot, or so he claimed, though Ruth muttered something about him always having his eye on anything he thought was going cheap. Girl blows into town, inherits a condemned building nobody else wanted, and a month later there's cash in the floor. Makes you wonder how long she knew. Mara felt her whole body go tight and still. The old instinct, the one that had gotten her through group homes and a cousin's betrayal both. Go quiet, go small, don't give them anything to grab onto. But Ruth, filling coffee 2 booths down, didn't so much as look up. She's earned every splinter in her hands fixing that roof, Hollis, which is more than I can say for you, and that storage lot you wanted to charge the county double market rate for, Ruth said, mild as Sunday, and the diner's other 3 occupied booths found that a good deal funnier than Hollis did. It didn't end there, though. Somebody, Mara never confirmed who, though she had her suspicions, filed a complaint with the county about the structural safety of continued renovation work being done on a building with an inheritance dispute potentially pending. And for 2 long weeks, Mara found herself buried in phone calls to a county records office 40 miles away, trying to prove a claim that was, legally, not actually in dispute at all. It cost her money she'd meant to put toward materials. It cost her 4 days of work stopped cold, while an inspector who clearly didn't want to be there walked the property with a clipboard and a bad attitude, muttering about load-bearing walls and code compliance for a building that predated most modern code by a century. They're trying to scare you off, Cole told her, the 2 of them sitting on the church steps at the end of one particularly draining day, the inspector's truck just having pulled away down the gravel track. Somebody around here's decided you're easy pickings. New girl, no family, a pile of cash, they figure you don't know how to hold on to. Maybe I don't, Mara admitted, and it cost her something to say it out loud. I've never had this much money at once in my life. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with it that doesn't end up like... She stopped herself before she said Denny's name, but Cole heard the shape of the sentence anyway and didn't push. You're doing something with it already, he said instead, nodding back at the building behind them. New glass in half the windows now, the roof fully patched, the front steps re-poured in concrete that would outlast both of them. That's not nothing. It was around then that the real setback came, the kind neither complaint nor gossip could manufacture. A hard frost came early that year, a full month ahead of what even Ruth called normal, and it found a crack in the old well casing that nobody had thought to check. And by the 3rd morning of freezing nights, Mara woke to find her only water source, frozen solid, and split clean through, unusable until spring, without an expensive repair she absolutely could not afford, on top of everything the county complaint had already cost her. She stood at the well that morning in the grey early light, breath-fogging, staring down into a shaft that had given her clean water without complaint since her first day in this town, and felt something in her chest go tight and small, in a way it hadn't since the parking lot behind the bakery, since Denny's truck pulling away. Everything I fix, something else breaks. It was the closest she'd come since arriving to actually wanting to leave, not because the town had beaten her, but because for one cold morning it felt like the building itself might be more determined to fall down than she was determined to hold it up. She didn't call Cole that morning. She sat down hard on the frozen ground beside the broken well casing and, for the first time since she'd arrived in Amity Hollow, let herself cry the way she hadn't let herself cry over the bakery, over Denny, over $11 and a duffel bag, not careful, not contained, just the whole cold weight of it coming up at once. It was Ruth who found her there an hour later, having driven out unannounced with a thermos of coffee and, as it turned out, a phone number for a well driller 2 towns over who owed her a favor going back decades. Ruth didn't say much. She sat down on the frozen ground next to Mara in a coat clearly too thin for the weather and let her cry it out. And when Mara finally quieted, Ruth said only, "Everybody who ever built anything worth having sat right about where you're sitting at least once. Questions not whether you fall down, questions whether you get up looking the same or looking like you learned something." Mara didn't have an answer for that yet, but she took the coffee and she took the phone number, and by that afternoon, the well driller had come out to look at the damage, and quoted her a price that was fair, if not cheap, and would take 3 days of work. She genuinely wasn't sure the county complaint hadn't already eaten the money for. That night, doing the math by flashlight on the back of the same bulletin where she'd once written her list of unanswered questions, Mara found herself 1 column short, enough for the well repair or enough to keep the county inspector's demanded improvements moving before his next visit. Not both. She sat with the numbers a long time, the church settling and creaking around her the way it did every night now, a sound she'd stopped finding frightening and started finding almost companionable. Somewhere behind the pulpit, the locked cabinet sat waiting, and she thought again of Elias's letter. The money will run out, the way money does, if that's all you use it for, and understood, with a cold certainty that had nothing to do with the frost outside, that whatever choice she made tonight was the first real test of whether she'd actually understood what he'd been trying to tell her. She still didn't have an answer by the time she finally slept, but somewhere in the dark hours before dawn, she dreamed, for the first time since she'd arrived, not of Denny's truck pulling away, but of a woman in a pale dress, standing on the church steps, laughing at something just outside the frame, and when Mara woke, she found she finally knew which choice she was going to make. She chose the well. It wasn't really a hard choice by morning light, not the way it had felt at 2 in the dark. A building could wait on paint and permits. A person couldn't wait on water. She called the driller back, told him to come ahead, and resigned herself to whatever the inspector found on his next pass. Because a woman who let herself go thirsty to satisfy a man with a clipboard and a grudge wasn't someone Elias Whitfield would have recognized as worth leaving anything to. The inspector came back on a Thursday, and to Mara's genuine surprise, walked the property in about a third the time he had the first visit, signed off on everything without the muttering, and left without so much as mentioning the well repairs timeline. She asked Ruth about it that afternoon, half joking, and Ruth's face did something complicated. "Might be somebody had a word with the county," Ruth said, which was as much as she'd admit to, and Mara didn't press, though she had a strong suspicion the word in question had come from a woman who'd run the town's diner since before most of the county's current officials had been born, and who knew, therefore, more or less everyone's business back 3 administrations. The well driller finished his work in 2 days instead of 3, refused to explain the discount he gave her, and Amity Hollow's particular brand of quiet, unasked-for generosity started to feel, for the first time, less like an accident and more like a pattern. Hollis Pratt was still cold to her every time she passed the hardware store. But Hollis, she was starting to understand, was the exception being allowed to prove a rule the rest of the town had already decided about her. It was in that stretch of relative calm, water running again, the county satisfied, the roof and windows and steps all sound, that Mara finally turned her full attention back to the cabinet. She'd read Elias's letter enough times by now that she'd stopped needing to unfold it to remember the words. "I have left the key somewhere I trust the right person to find, if they care enough to keep looking." She'd searched the obvious places first, under floorboards near the cabinet, inside the strongbox itself, taped beneath drawers and shelves throughout the vestibule, and found nothing, and had begun to wonder if the key had simply been lost to time, one more thing Elias had meant to finish and never managed. It was Cole in the end who found it, more or less by accident. He was up in the bell tower checking the last of the frame timbers when his flashlight caught a small tin box wedged into a gap behind the bell's mounting bracket, rusted nearly shut, easy to miss unless you were exactly where he happened to be standing. Inside, wrapped in the same oilcloth as the letter and the strongbox, was a single brass key, small and old-fashioned, and a folded scrap of paper with 3 words in Elias's shaking hand. "For Marion's sake." Mara held that key a long time before she brought it downstairs. She waited until evening, until the light through the broken window had gone gold and low, before she knelt in front of the cabinet, with Cole standing a respectful few feet back, the way he had at the floor. Her hands were steadier this time than they'd been with the strongbox, not because the moment mattered less, but because she'd started to understand, over these past weeks, that whatever waited behind locked things in this building was never going to be something to fear. It was going to be something to finish. The key turned with a stiffness that gave way all at once, the same way the floorboard had, and the cabinet door swung open on hinges that hadn't moved in decades. Inside, there was no second strongbox, no bundle of cash. There was a small wooden box, carved rather than built, clearly handmade with more patience than skill, and inside that, folded with the particular care of something handled many times over many years, was a wedding dress, pale, simple, yellowed softly with age but otherwise whole, and, tucked into its folds, a second photograph, this one of Marion alone, laughing at the camera in a way that made her look, for one unguarded instant, entirely alive. And beneath the dress, at the bottom of the box, a second letter, shorter than the first, written in a hand so unsteady it was barely legible in places. Clearly, the last thing Elias had ever managed to put down on paper. I could never open this door after she went. I told myself it was because I couldn't bear to see her dress again. The truth, which I am only brave enough to write because I know I'll be gone before anyone reads it, is that I promised her, near the end, that I would live. Not just keep breathing, but live. And I broke that promise every single day. For 10 years I spent wandering, unable to come home, and every day since that I spent alone in this building instead of among people the way she would have wanted. I could not open this cabinet, because opening it meant admitting how badly I had failed the one thing she ever asked of me. If you are the one who finds this, I hope it means you found your own way to keep a promise I couldn't. I hope it means this building is finally full of the kind of noise she used to love. People, arguing and laughing and needing each other, the way a church is supposed to sound. That is the only thing behind this door worth finding. Not her dress, not this dying old man's guilt. Just this. Don't wait as long as I did to start living the promise you make to the people you love. However much time you think you have, it is less than you believe, and it goes faster than any of us are ready for. Whatever this building becomes now, let it become that. Mara sat on the floor of the nave with Marion's letter. No, Elias's, but somehow it felt like both of theirs now, inseparable, in her lap, and Cole sat down beside her without being asked, the way Ruth had at the well, and for a long while neither of them said anything at all. The light through the window had gone from gold to violet to nearly gone, and somewhere in the settling dark, Mara understood that the last mystery this building had been holding wasn't money and wasn't even really a locked door. It was a decade of one man's grief, finally, fully, forgiven by the only person left who could forgive it. A stranger, 23 years old, who'd walked in with $11 and found, instead of treasure, something closer to a responsibility. She didn't know yet exactly what she was going to build here, but she knew, sitting in the near dark with a dead man's confession in her hands, that it was going to be loud, it was going to be full of people, and it was never, ever going to sit locked and silent and grieving alone again. The idea came to her almost fully formed, the way the best ones sometimes do, in the grey hour just before sleep, a community centre, not a church in the old sense. She wasn't a preacher, had no calling to be one, but a building that did what Elias's letter asked of it, full of noise, full of people, arguing and laughing and needing each other. A supper hall 2 nights a week for anyone in town who wanted company and a hot meal. A workshop where Cole could teach kids the kind of carpentry that had no place left to be taught since the high school cut its shop program. A room, eventually, for whatever Amity Hollow's next generation of stubborn, half-lost young people needed that nobody else was providing. She told Ruth first, over coffee, half expecting to be told it was too big a dream for a woman with a half-emptied strongbox, and 11 weeks of experience owning property. Ruth's eyes went wet before Mara even finished explaining it. He'd have wanted that, Ruth said, more than he'd have wanted a church back. Lord knows this town's got enough places to pray, it's short on places to just be together. The plans took shape fast, faster than the money strictly allowed, which was its own kind of warning Mara didn't fully heed. She'd hired a second contractor beyond Cole to speed the interior work, a friend of Cole's from 2 towns over, cheaper than he should have been, and it was there, in the rush to make good on a promise before winter fully set in, that the near disaster found its opening. It happened on a Tuesday, with the wood stove going hard against an early cold snap and sawdust thick in the air. From a week of interior framing, nobody had thought to sweep properly at day's end. Mara was up in the bell tower with Cole, hanging the last of the new bell rope he'd insisted on running before first snow, when the smell of smoke reached them both at the same moment. By the time they got down the tower stairs, the back corner of the nave, where the stove sat, where sawdust had drifted in loose piles against the baseboard all week, was already burning, low and orange, and spreading fast along a floor gone dry, as kindling from months of careful restoration work. What happened in the next 20 minutes, Mara would only ever remember in pieces afterward. Cole shouting for the fire department on a phone with 1 bar of signal, herself grabbing the stockpot she'd once used to catch rain and filling it, again and again, at the well she'd nearly lost that frozen morning weeks before. The particular terror of watching flame lick up toward the old oak timber frame that had survived a century of weather and neglect, and might, in 20 more minutes, not survive her. It was the training Cole had given her without either of them realizing it was training. The hours of learning which beams were sound, which sections had been recently reinforced, where the fire could be contained versus where it would find fresh fuel, that let her direct the fight instead of simply flailing at it. She remembered Elias's newer siding sections, patched in over the old, denser and less dry than the original wood. She steered the worst of the flame away from the tower stairs and toward a section of floor she knew, from weeks of crawling over every inch of this building, had been recently replaced and wouldn't catch as fast. She wasn't fighting the fire with luck. She was fighting it with everything the building itself had taught her. The volunteer fire company arrived from the next town over 25 minutes after Cole's call, a lifetime by the clock, but not quite a lifetime for the church. They found the blaze contained to one corner, smoke thick and ugly, but not catastrophic, thanks to a well that hadn't failed her twice, and a young woman who'd apparently learned this building's bones better than most people learn their own homes. She stood outside afterward, soot-streaked, hands blistered from the stockpot handle, watching firefighters finish dousing the last smoldering timbers, and felt something break loose in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. It was the opposite of fear. She had almost lost this place, this building she'd arrived at with $11 and no plan beyond survival. And in the moment it mattered most, she hadn't frozen. She hadn't run. She had known, with her whole body, exactly what to do, because somewhere in these past weeks, she had stopped being a person passing through this church and become someone who genuinely belonged to it. Ruth arrived not long after, having heard the volunteer company's radio call over her own scanner, and found Mara sitting on the church steps, wrapped in a firefighter's blanket, staring at the scorched corner of her own future with an expression Ruth would later describe, to more than one person in town, as looking less like grief than like recognition. "You saved it," Ruth said, sitting down heavy beside her. "I saved what he built it to be for," Mara said, and surprised herself with how steady her voice came out. "Not the wood, the reason for the wood." The damage, once the smoke cleared and the insurance adjuster from the county seat finally made his way out, turned out to be far less than the fire's 20 minutes had made it feel like. One corner of flooring, a section of wall, smoke damage to clean rather than structural loss to rebuild. Cole, examining the scorched beams the next morning with the same careful attention he'd once given the roofline, delivered his verdict flatly. Bones held. Whatever your uncle built this frame to survive, I don't think he was thinking about fire specifically, but he built it to last regardless. You didn't get lucky, you got sturdy. Mara stood in the ash-smelling nave that morning, running her hand along a section of soot-blackened but structurally sound oak, and thought of Elias's letter, "Let it become that," and understood, with a clarity the fire seemed to have burned into her rather than out of her, that she had just proven something to herself she hadn't fully believed until the flames made her prove it, that whatever she built here now, she wasn't building it out of 11 desperate dollars and nowhere else to go anymore. She was building it because she had chosen, with everything on the line, to fight for it. That was a different kind of ownership than a $1.40 deed had ever given her, and it was the first moment since she'd arrived in Amity Hollow that she let herself believe, all the way down, that she was staying. Word of the fire, and of how it had ended, rather than how it might have, moved through Amity Hollow faster than any gossip about buried money ever had. There is a particular kind of respect a small town saves for someone who fights for a thing with her own two hands while the town watches, and by the following week, Mara felt it everywhere. In the extra nod from men at the feed store who'd never once looked her way before. In a stack of donated lumber that appeared at the church one morning with no note and no bill. In the sudden, unasked-for offer from 3 different women in town to help organize the first community supper once the smoke-damaged corner was patched. Even Hollis Pratt came by, awkward and gruff, to drop off a box of hardware supplies he insisted was just stuff sitting in the back gathering dust, and left before Mara could properly thank him, which Ruth said afterward was as close to an apology as Hollis Pratt had issued to another living soul in a decade. The repairs went fast, with real help now instead of scraped-together labor, and the community center Mara had sketched out in her head started becoming an actual, physical thing. A long table taking shape in what had been the nave, a workshop corner for Cole's carpentry lessons, a bulletin board by the door where, within days of it going up, someone had already pinned a handwritten notice offering to teach knitting on Thursday evenings, and someone else had pinned a reply asking if there was room for one more. It was in the middle of this, sawdust and laughter, and the particular busy noise of a building finally being used the way it was built to be used, that a girl showed up at the door one afternoon, maybe 19, thin in a way that had nothing to do with diet and everything to do with not enough meals, carrying a backpack and nothing else, asking in a voice gone careful and flat if this was the place where a person could maybe get a hot meal without having to explain a whole life story to earn it. Mara knew that voice. She'd used that voice herself, 3 months and a lifetime ago, in a parking lot behind a bakery. The girl's name was Della. She'd aged out of the foster system 8 months back, same as Mara once had, and had been sleeping in a car 2 towns over since a job fell through and a landlord ran out of patience. She'd heard, through the particular grapevine that runs between people with nowhere else to be, that there was a place out past Amity Hollow where a person could get fed without a lecture attached. Mara fed her first, asked questions second, and only the ones Della seemed ready to answer. Watching Della eat, carefully, the way a person eats when they've learned not to trust that a meal is really theirs to finish, Mara felt something shift into place that she hadn't fully anticipated when she'd first sketched out her plans for this building. She'd imagined a supper hall, a workshop, a bulletin board. She hadn't quite let herself imagine this. A mirror of herself, 3 months younger in circumstance if not in years, sitting at Elias and Marion's long table, because word had traveled that somebody out this way understood what it meant to have nothing and nowhere. She didn't tell Della her own story that first night. But she gave her a corner of the vestibule to sleep in, dry, warm from the wood stove, safer than a car 2 towns over, and told her, plainly, that nobody here was going to make her explain herself to earn a meal or a roof, because somebody had once extended Mara that same grace when she badly needed it, even if it had taken the shape of a rotting building and a $40 deed, rather than a person's kindness directly. Over the following days, Della stayed, tentative at first and then less so, and started helping around the place without being asked, sweeping, hauling, the same instinct toward quiet usefulness that Mara recognized because she'd built her own life on that exact instinct. Cole taught her, alongside 2 other town kids, the basics of sanding and staining wood, and Della turned out to have a careful, patient hand for it that surprised even her. It was watching Della work a plane along a rough board one afternoon, tongue caught between her teeth in concentration, that Mara understood, fully, finally, what Elias's letter had actually been describing all along. The chance is the only inheritance that ever really mattered. He hadn't meant the strongbox. He hadn't even really meant the building. He'd meant this exact moment. A person with nothing handed a foundation sturdy enough to stand on, and doing, with that foundation, something that reached past themselves to catch the next person falling the same way they once had. She thought about the legacy recipient she hadn't known she was writing herself toward becoming. 3 months ago, $11 in her pocket and a duffel bag of clothes. She thought about a young preacher and his young wife, laughing on church steps in a photograph gone soft with age, building a congregation out of nothing because Marion believed a church was just people deciding to keep showing up for each other. She thought about 19 years of solitary grief, finally answered, not by a stranger finding buried treasure, but by that treasure becoming the reason a 19-year-old girl with nowhere else to go had a warm corner to sleep in tonight. That evening, after Della had gone to sleep in the vestibule and Cole had rattled off down the gravel track, Mara sat at the long table in the nave, Elias and Marion's letters both folded together now in the same oilcloth wrapping, kept safe in a drawer she'd built into the new front desk, and allowed herself, for the first time since she'd arrived, to simply feel proud of what her hands had built rather than braced for the next thing to go wrong. Outside, the shutter that used to knock loose against the wall had long since been rehung true by Cole's careful hand, and the building, for the first time in longer than anyone in Amity Hollow could remember, was entirely, peacefully quiet. Not the silence of abandonment, but the settled, satisfied quiet of a day's honest work finally done. Winter came hard that year, the way it does in that part of the country, but the community center held, roof sound, well running clean, wood stove drawing steady through the coldest nights anyone in Amity Hollow could remember. By the time the first thaw came, the long table in what used to be the nave had hosted 11 Thursday suppers. Cole's workshop had turned out a dozen finished birdhouses and 1 genuinely fine cutting board built entirely by Della's careful hands, and the bulletin board by the door had filled up twice over with notices nobody had asked Mara's permission to pin there, which was, she'd come to understand, exactly the point. Della stayed through the winter and into spring, and by the time the first real warmth came back to Amity Hollow, she'd found steady work at the feed store, a room to rent 2 streets over from Ruth's diner, and a standing Thursday night seat at the long table that she never once missed, even after she no longer needed the roof or the meal. She'd started, in quiet moments, teaching the newest arrival, a boy of 17, aged out and adrift the way she and Mara both once had been, the same careful patience with a plane and a piece of rough wood that Cole had once taught her. Mara watched that particular chain link into place one Thursday evening. Della bent over the boy's shoulder, correcting his grip on the tool the exact way Cole had once corrected hers, and understood that this was the actual, living shape of what Elias had been trying to describe in a shaking hand at the end of his life. Not a strongbox, not a deed. A foundation sturdy enough that the person standing on it could turn around and offer a hand to whoever came looking next. She still had the letters, both of them, kept safe in the drawer she'd built for them, and she read them again on a quiet evening in early spring, alone in the nave after the last supper guests had gone home, and Della had walked the new boy back to the room she'd helped him find. She read the line she'd carried with her the longest. The money will run out, the way money does, if that's all you use it for, and understood, finally, all the way down, that it had been true. The Strongbox's cash had gone into lumber and glass, and a well repair, and 100 small hungers fed at a long table, and it was gone now, mostly, spent the way Elias had warned her it would be. But the church still stood, the town still gathered, Della still taught the boy to hold a plane steady. None of that had run out, none of that ever would, not the way money did, because it wasn't the kind of thing that could be spent down to nothing. It only grew, the more it got given away. She'd also, over that winter, finally found the courage to walk the old timberland Elias's deed described, 2 counties over, acreage nobody had touched in 50 years, timber grown thick and untouched, worth more now standing than his family had ever made selling off the original parcel's rights. She hadn't decided yet what to do with it, but she'd started to suspect, walking those quiet woods with Cole beside her, that whatever came next for this town's newest generation of Dellas and quiet 17-year-old boys, that land might be part of the answer, the way the church already was. On a clear evening at the very end of spring, with the church windows all repaired now and catching the sunset in bands of red and amber glass, exactly the way they must have looked the day Elias and Marion first opened those doors, Mara stood on the front steps, solid, level, poured to outlast her, and let herself think one more time about the version of herself who'd stood in a bakery parking lot with $11 and no plan beyond surviving the next hour. That woman couldn't have imagined this. Not the supper table, not Della, not a town that had gone from suspicious to fiercely protective of her in the space of one hard winter. Not the particular, settled peace of standing in a doorway that no longer smelled like rot and rain, but like wood smoke and fresh-cut lumber, and faintly, the bread Ruth insisted on baking fresh every Thursday for the supper table. She thought, too, about the lesson underneath all of it, the one she suspected, applied well past the borders of Amity Hollow, well past rotting churches and buried strongboxes, and old preachers' unfinished grief, that the worst thing that ever happens to you isn't always the end of your story. Sometimes it's the strange, unlikely doorway into the only version of your life that was ever actually going to fit. Mara had walked through hers with $11 and a duffel bag, expecting nothing, and found instead a foundation sturdy enough to build an entire second life on. One built, in the end, not out of money at all, but out of exactly what Elias had promised, the chance, and what she'd chosen to do with it. If you've ever found yourself starting over with next to nothing, wondering whether the worst moment of your life might secretly be the beginning of something you can't see yet, I hope this one found you at the right time. If it did, stay a while longer with us here. Subscribe, and let us know in the comments, what's the one chance somebody once gave you that changed everything? Because somewhere out there tonight, in some other rotting building or empty parking lot, or ordinary hard moment, somebody else is about to find their own version of what Mara found in Amity Hollow. And chances are, they're going to need to hear that it's possible before they believe it for themselves.